"You cheated on me from the very beginning," he shouted. Seconds later, 3 identical boys with his eyes turned his certainty into tears. The chandelier above the ballroom cast warm light over polished marble floors and elegant tables, but the atmosphere shifted the moment Ethan Blake's voice cut through the soft music. It wasn't just loud, it was sharp, edged with years of unresolved resentment that had been waiting for a reason to explode. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, glasses froze in hands, and an uncomfortable silence spread outward like a ripple. "You cheated on me from the very beginning." Ethan stood rigid, his jaw tight, his dark hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes burning with a certainty he had never questioned. As the CEO of a powerful corporation, he was used to command, to authority, to being right. People rarely challenged him, and when they did, he crushed resistance without hesitation. Tonight, he felt justified. Tonight, he believed the past had finally caught up with the woman standing in front of him. Claire Morgan did not react the way the crowd expected. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, her posture calm, almost unnervingly so, as if she had already survived something far worse than public humiliation. Her brown hair was pulled back neatly, her brown eyes steady, focused not on Ethan, but on the 3 small boys beside her. The boys clung to her hands, identical in every visible way. Dark hair, the same sharp cheekbones, the same bright blue eyes that didn't belong to her at all. They were dressed neatly, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting, shifting their weight from foot to foot as they sensed tension they were too young to understand. Ethan noticed them only after a few seconds, when the silence stretched too long. His eyes dropped, and his breath caught. For a brief moment, his anger faltered, confused by a recognition he couldn't immediately place. The resemblance was unsettling. Not vague. Not imagined. It was undeniable, reflected in the shape of their faces, the color of their eyes, the familiar tilt of one boy's head as he studied Ethan with cautious curiosity. Claire felt the shift instantly. She tightened her grip on the boy's hands, positioning herself subtly in front of them, shielding them without making it obvious. She had known this moment might come one day, but she hadn't expected it to arrive like this, under crystal lights and judgmental stares. "You have no right," Ethan continued, his voice lower now but no less intense, "to stand here like nothing happened." Claire finally looked at him. The years had changed him less than she had expected. He still wore confidence like armor, still believed that certainty was strength. What he didn't see, what she saw clearly, was the fear beneath it, the same fear that had driven him away 4 years ago. "You're causing a scene," she said quietly. That only fueled him. "A scene?" he repeated bitterly. "You disappeared. You erased yourself. And now you just show up here as if..." One of the boys tugged gently at her hand. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small but steady, "why is he mad?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Ethan stopped mid-sentence. The word mom echoed in his mind, colliding violently with the image in front of him. 3 boys. 4 years old. The timeline slammed into place with brutal precision, and for the first time that night, something inside him cracked. Claire lowered herself to their level, her voice calm, practiced, protective. "It's okay," she said softly. "Sometimes adults say things they don't fully understand." She looked up at Ethan again, and there was no anger in her eyes now. Only exhaustion. And something else, resolve. The crowd around them pretended not to listen, but no one looked away. Ethan felt the weight of every stare, every unspoken judgment, yet for the first time in his life, none of it mattered. All that mattered were the 3 identical boys standing between him and the woman he had once accused without proof. And the terrible, growing realization that the truth he had avoided for years was no longer willing to stay hidden. For years earlier, the night had ended very differently. Claire remembered it with painful clarity, every detail etched into her memory as if her mind had refused to let it fade. The apartment had been too quiet after Ethan's voice rose in accusation, his words sharp and final, cutting through everything they had built together. He hadn't listened. He hadn't wanted to. To him, certainty had felt safer than doubt, and anger had been easier than fear. She had left with nothing but her bag and shaking hands, walking down the stairs while her legs felt weak beneath her. The city outside had been loud and indifferent, lights flashing, cars passing, people living their lives without knowing that hers had just split open. That same night, in the privacy of a bathroom lit by a single flickering bulb, she had stared at a pregnancy test until the lines blurred through tears. She hadn't called him. At first, it was shock. Then pride. Then the quiet understanding that calling him would change nothing. Ethan had already decided who she was in his mind, and no truth would survive against that decision. She told herself she would wait, that maybe he would calm down, that maybe he would reach out. Days passed. Then weeks. Silence became confirmation. The pregnancy was harder than she ever expected. Morning sickness lingered well into the second trimester, and the fatigue was relentless, sinking deep into her bones. When the doctor told her she was carrying triplets, Claire laughed hysterically before breaking down completely. The future she had barely begun to process suddenly multiplied into something terrifying and overwhelming. She worked until her body refused to cooperate, saving every dollar, counting every expense, cutting away anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Friends offered sympathy, but sympathy didn't pay rent or calm the fear that crept in during sleepless nights. Through it all, she refused to think of Ethan as someone she could rely on. That door, once closed, stayed closed. The birth was chaotic and frightening, the room filled with voices and movement as 3 tiny lives entered the world far too early. When she finally held them, one after another, she felt a fierce, desperate love crash over her, powerful enough to push everything else aside. In that moment, fear transformed into resolve. Lucas. Noah. Evan. 3 names she whispered like a vow. The early years were brutal. 3 crying infants meant no rest, no silence, no space to fall apart. Claire learned to function on fragments of sleep, to move automatically through each day, feeding, soothing, holding, surviving. There were nights when she sat on the floor, all 3 boys crying at once, tears streaming down her own face as she rocked them with shaking arms, promising again and again that she wouldn't give up. She never told them lies about their father. She simply didn't speak of him at all. As the boys grew, their similarities became impossible to ignore. The same dark hair. The same blue eyes that reflected a man who wasn't there. Sometimes strangers would comment on how striking they looked together, and Claire would smile politely, swallowing the sharp ache those remarks stirred inside her. There were moments when anger threatened to surface, moments when exhaustion whispered that life would have been easier if she had demanded something from Ethan, anything at all. But she pushed those thoughts away. She had chosen independence not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Her sons needed stability, not conflict. By the time the boys turned 4, Claire had built a life that worked. Not perfectly. Not easily. But honestly. She had learned to carry responsibility without resentment, love without expectation, and strength without witnesses. She believed the past was behind her. She had no idea that a single night, a single accusation spoken too loudly, would tear it all open again, forcing truths she had never intended to reveal and confronting her with the man she had once trusted with everything. The charity gala had never meant more to Claire than any other professional obligation. She had worked for months coordinating donors, schedules, performers, and speeches, making sure every detail aligned perfectly so the cause would speak louder than the people attached to it. For her, the evening represented competence and independence, proof that she had built something meaningful with her own hands. She had not anticipated that it would become a collision point between past and present. She arrived early with the boys, keeping them close as staff bustled around adjusting lighting and arranging tables. Lucas, Noah, and Evan were restless in their small suits, identical in appearance but already distinct in temperament. Lucas stayed close, holding onto her sleeve and watching everything carefully. Noah asked endless questions about the decorations and the music. Evan bounced on his heels, eager to explore, testing boundaries with a grin that made it impossible to stay stern for long. Claire knelt in front of them, adjusting collars and smoothing hair, reminding herself to breathe. She had debated leaving them with a sitter, but the event was child-friendly and the boys had begged to come. She hadn't wanted to deny them something harmless out of her own caution. Besides, she had scanned the guest list carefully. Ethan's name had not been there. The first hour passed without incident. Guests arrived, donations were announced, and polite applause filled the room. Claire moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting sponsors, coordinating staff, and checking in with performers, always keeping the boys within sight. They stayed close to a table near the edge of the hall, whispering to one another and observing the unfamiliar world around them. Then she felt it. It wasn't a sound or a movement at first, but a sudden tightening in her chest, a sensation she had learned not to ignore. She looked up instinctively, her gaze sweeping the room, and that was when she saw him. Ethan stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by people who listened to him intently, his posture confident, his presence commanding attention without effort. Time compressed brutally. For a moment, Claire was no longer in the ballroom but back in that apartment years ago, standing across from a man who had chosen certainty over trust. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She turned slightly, positioning herself closer to the boys, her hand resting protectively on Evan's shoulder. She told herself to stay calm, that there was no reason for interaction, that the evening could pass without acknowledgement. She had learned to coexist with the memory of him. She could coexist with his presence too. She was wrong. Ethan noticed her almost immediately. His eyes locked onto her with the same intensity she remembered all too well, and she saw the recognition spark, followed quickly by anger that had never truly cooled. He excused himself from the conversation around him and walked toward her with purpose, his steps quick and unhesitating. Claire felt the boys tense beside her, sensing the shift in energy even before words were spoken. That was when he shouted. The accusation tore through the room, loud and sharp, stripping away the careful decorum of the event. Claire felt dozens of eyes swing toward them, felt judgment and curiosity press in from all sides. She had prepared herself for many things over the past 4 years, but not for this kind of public reckoning. She didn't answer him. Silence felt safer than any defense she could offer. She focused instead on the boys, on the weight of their hands in hers, on the grounding reality of their presence. She told herself that this moment, however humiliating, would pass. But Ethan's gaze had already shifted. She saw it happen in real time, the confusion breaking through his anger as his eyes dropped to the children. She watched his certainty fracture, watched recognition struggle to surface against disbelief. It was almost unbearable to witness, not because she felt sorry for him, but because she had known this moment would come eventually, and no amount of preparation could soften it. When the boys spoke, when one of them asked why he was yelling, something in Ethan finally collapsed. Claire felt it like a tremor running through the air between them. She answered calmly, protecting the boys from the storm they had wandered into without warning. The room remained frozen, suspended between scandal and revelation, and Claire understood with quiet certainty that nothing would be the same after tonight. The life she had built so carefully had just been exposed to a truth she had kept contained for years. She looked at Ethan one last time before turning her attention fully back to her sons. Whatever happened next would happen on her terms. She had survived far worse than a man realizing too late what he had lost. The gala resumed in fragments after the confrontation, though nothing truly returned to normal. Conversations restarted in hushed tones, laughter sounded forced, and the music no longer carried the same lightness. Claire felt the weight of the room pressing in on her from all sides, but she kept her expression composed, guiding the boys away from the center of attention with calm, practiced movements. She led them toward a quieter corner near the terrace doors, crouching down to meet their eyes. "You did nothing wrong," she said gently, smoothing Noah's hair as he watched her with wide eyes. "Sometimes adults forget how to speak kindly. That's all." Lucas nodded slowly, accepting her words with the seriousness he applied to everything, while Evan leaned into her side, already more interested in the desserts arranged nearby than in the tension that had just unfolded. Claire allowed herself a small exhale. The boys were resilient, but she refused to let this moment scar them. When she stood again, Ethan was there. Not looming, not shouting, but standing a few steps away as if unsure whether he was allowed to be close. The anger that had fueled his outburst had drained from his face, replaced by something far more unsettling. Shock. Doubt. And a growing, undeniable fear. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Claire met his gaze without flinching. "Not here," she replied. "And not tonight." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. For the first time she could remember, he didn't push back. He glanced at the boys again, his eyes lingering on details he could no longer ignore. The identical curve of their brows. The familiar set of their mouths. Each observation seemed to strike him physically, as if realization carried weight. "How long have you known?" he asked. Claire's voice remained steady. "Since before you walked away." That truth landed harder than any accusation she could have thrown at him. Ethan swallowed, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. "Why didn't you tell me?" he pressed, though the question sounded weaker even as he asked it. Claire's patience thinned, not into anger, but into clarity. "I did tell you who I was," she said. "You decided I was lying. I didn't see the point in fighting someone who had already chosen his version of the truth." For a moment, Ethan looked as though he might argue, but the words never came. The weight of 4 years pressed down on him, heavy and unyielding. He glanced around, suddenly aware of how public this place was, how exposed the situation had become. "Please," he said again, softer now. "Just tell me, are they mine?" Claire did not answer immediately. She looked back at the boys, who were now whispering excitedly over a plate of pastries, blissfully unaware of the question that hovered in the air. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but resolute. "Yes," she said. "All 3 of them." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if the word alone might knock him off balance. When he opened them again, there was moisture there he didn't bother to hide. "I didn't know," he whispered. "No," Claire agreed. "You didn't want to." The distinction mattered. She reached for the boys' hands again, signaling the end of the conversation. "We're leaving," she said, not unkindly, but firmly. "They've had enough for one night." Ethan stepped aside automatically, watching them move past him as if the space they left behind had suddenly grown impossibly wide. As they reached the doors, Lucas turned back briefly, his blue eyes studying Ethan with the same thoughtful curiosity he offered the world. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. Outside, the cool night air felt like relief. Claire buckled the boys into the car with steady hands, her mind racing even as her movements remained controlled. She had known this moment would come eventually, but knowing did not make it easier. As she drove away, the lights of the venue shrinking in the rearview mirror, she allowed herself a single thought before pushing it aside. The past had finally caught up with them. And now, there would be consequences for everyone. The night did not end for Ethan when the doors of the venue closed behind Claire and the boys. In many ways, it was only beginning. He remained standing in the quieted hall long after the guests resumed their conversations, long after staff began clearing glasses and adjusting lights as if nothing irreversible had occurred. The charity gala continued, but Ethan no longer belonged to it. The world he had known felt distant, artificial, stripped of relevance by a truth that refused to stay buried. He left without saying goodbye to anyone. The drive home passed in fragments. Traffic lights blurred together, streets lost their names, and his thoughts circled the same unbearable realization over and over. 3 boys. 4 years old. His sons. The certainty he had lived by collapsed under the weight of what he had never questioned. He replayed the past relentlessly, searching for moments where he could have stopped, listened, doubted himself even briefly. Each memory ended the same way, with his own voice louder than Claire's, his anger more convincing than her silence. At home, the penthouse felt colder than usual. Too large. Too empty. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by objects chosen for status rather than comfort, and for the first time felt no attachment to any of it. He poured a glass of whiskey out of habit, then set it down untouched. His hands were shaking. He sank onto the couch and covered his face, breath coming unevenly. The image of the boys rose uninvited in his mind, their identical expressions, the way one had tilted his head just like he did when thinking. That small detail broke something open inside him. The realization was no longer abstract. It was personal. Physical. For the first time since childhood, Ethan cried without trying to stop himself. Not quiet tears meant to be hidden, but raw, uncontrolled sobs that left him gasping, his body folding inward under the weight of regret. He cried for the children who had learned to walk and speak without him. He cried for the nights Claire had spent alone, exhausted and afraid. He cried for the man he had been, so certain of his own judgment that he had never considered the cost of being wrong. When the storm passed, what remained was silence and resolve. The next morning, Ethan made the call that had once terrified him. A clinic appointment. A DNA test. He did not ask Claire's permission before scheduling it, but he did not demand anything from her either. He sent a message, brief and direct, telling her what he intended to do and adding that he would accept whatever terms she set. Hours passed before she replied. When she did, her response was simple. She agreed. The waiting was unbearable. Every day stretched endlessly as Ethan tried and failed to distract himself with work. Meetings blurred together, his usual sharp focus dulled by constant intrusion of thought. He found himself watching fathers on the street, noticing small boys everywhere, imagining who his sons might be in moments he had never witnessed. The world seemed suddenly filled with reminders of what he had lost before he even knew it existed. When the results arrived, there was no shock left to absorb them. The confirmation was absolute. Undeniable. 3 matches. 3 sons. Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the report until the words lost meaning. The proof did not change what he already knew in his bones, but it removed the last refuge of denial. This was no misunderstanding. No coincidence. This was consequence. He asked to see the boys. Claire did not answer immediately. When she finally agreed, her conditions were clear and unyielding. There would be no grand gestures, no sudden claims of fatherhood, no disruption of their lives. He would be introduced slowly, carefully, on her terms alone. If he failed once, she would disappear without hesitation. Ethan accepted every condition without argument. The first meeting took place in a small park on a weekday afternoon, far from crowds or expectations. Ethan arrived early and waited at a distance, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope. When Claire arrived with the boys, he felt his breath catch painfully in his chest. They ran ahead of her, laughing, unaware of the gravity of the moment. Ethan watched them with an intensity that bordered on reverence, memorizing every movement, every sound, as if afraid they might vanish again if he looked away. Claire stopped a few steps from him and met his gaze. There was no warmth there, but there was no hostility either. Only caution, sharpened by years of responsibility. "This doesn't make you their father yet," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied. "But I want to earn the right to be." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. The boys approached slowly, curiosity outweighing hesitation. One of them looked up at Ethan and asked plainly, "Are you the man from the party?" Ethan knelt to their level, his voice unsteady but honest. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry I scared you." The boy considered this, then shrugged, satisfied, and ran off again. Ethan felt something shift deep inside his chest. It was not forgiveness. It was a beginning. The weeks that followed tested Ethan in ways no boardroom battle ever had. He had built his life on authority, on quick decisions and clear outcomes, but nothing about this process offered certainty or control. Every interaction with the boys was measured, supervised, and brief, and every one of them mattered more than anything else he had ever done. The first visits were painfully short. Claire chose neutral places where the boys already felt comfortable, a quiet park, a small cafe with a play corner, a public library where whispers and routine softened the tension. Ethan arrived early every time and waited until Claire signaled that it was all right to approach. He introduced himself simply, by name only, careful not to claim a role he had not earned. Lucas, Noah, and Evan reacted differently to him, even in their sameness. Lucas watched him closely, asking direct questions and studying the answers with serious concentration. Noah was more open, chatting freely and laughing when Ethan attempted to play games he clearly didn't understand. Evan stayed close to Claire at first, peeking out from behind her leg, retreating whenever Ethan moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. Ethan learned restraint the hard way. He learned not to interrupt, not to correct, not to fill silence with explanations meant to ease his own discomfort. He learned that trust was not built by presence alone, but by consistency, by showing up exactly when promised and leaving exactly when asked. Each goodbye felt like a small fracture, but he accepted it without complaint, knowing that pushing would only set him back. At night, he returned to his apartment and felt the emptiness more sharply than ever before. The penthouse, once a symbol of achievement, now felt sterile and oversized, echoing with the absence of voices that did not yet belong to it. He found himself replaying moments from the visits, the way Noah had laughed when he tripped, the way Lucas had corrected him patiently, the way Evan had finally taken a step closer without being prompted. Those details became anchors, proof that progress, however slow, was real. Claire watched everything. She noticed how Ethan adapted without being asked, how he toned down his presence, how he followed her rules without resentment. She also noticed his exhaustion, the way his shoulders sagged after visits, the effort it took for him not to overstep. Part of her remained guarded, unwilling to trust easily after years of doing everything alone, but another part could not ignore what she was seeing. One afternoon, Evan fell while running and scraped his knee badly enough to cry. Claire moved instinctively, but Ethan was already kneeling beside him, stopping just short of touching him until Claire nodded. His voice was calm, grounding, offering reassurance without panic. Evan allowed him to stay, his crying easing as Ethan spoke softly, distracting him with a story about a superhero who hated scraped knees. It was a small moment, but it shifted something. After that day, Evan stopped hiding behind Claire's leg. He didn't rush toward Ethan, but he stayed closer, listening more, watching less warily. Lucas began asking questions about Ethan's job, about buildings and cars and places he had never seen. Noah declared one afternoon that Ethan was funny, and that alone felt like a victory. Still, the hardest part came not during the visits, but after them. One evening, as Claire walked the boys home, Lucas asked quietly, "Why didn't he come before?" Claire stopped in the hallway outside their apartment, the weight of the question pressing heavily on her chest. She knelt and looked at all three of them, choosing her words with care. "Because sometimes adults make mistakes when they're scared," she said. "And sometimes they take too long to fix them." Lucas nodded slowly, accepting the answer, but the question lingered in Claire's mind long after the boys had fallen asleep. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table, the familiar hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope, and the realization frightened her more than anger ever had. Hope meant vulnerability. It meant risk. Across the city, Ethan stood on his balcony, staring out at the lights, feeling a similar fear twist in his chest. He understood now that being present was only the beginning. Staying would require humility he had never practiced, patience he had never needed, and the courage to accept that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not erase the past. But for the first time since the night he had shouted accusations into a crowded room, Ethan was no longer afraid of the truth. He was afraid of losing it again. And that fear, he knew, was the price of finally caring enough to stay. Change did not arrive all at once, but it became undeniable in the quiet accumulation of moments Ethan could no longer ignore. The boys began expecting him, not with words, but with habits. They asked if he would be there before Claire mentioned the visit. They argued over who would sit closer to him on the bench. They spoke his name casually, weaving it into their stories as if it had always belonged there. That frightened Claire more than their initial distance ever had. She watched carefully, measuring not just Ethan's presence, but his endurance. It was easy to be attentive for a few weeks, even a few months. The real test was whether he would remain steady when things stopped feeling new, when effort replaced novelty. She looked for irritation, for impatience, for the old need to dominate. Instead, she found something else entirely. Ethan began asking questions he had never asked before. Not about logistics or schedules, but about the boys themselves. What scared them? What made them laugh? Which one needed reassurance and which one needed space? He listened to Claire's answers as if they mattered more than any briefing he had ever received, storing details carefully, using them without announcing it. One afternoon, Lucas refused to speak to him at all. The boy sat with his arms crossed, his expression stubborn and closed, answering Claire but not looking at Ethan. Noah tried to smooth things over with chatter, while Evan grew restless, sensing tension without understanding it. Ethan noticed immediately and resisted the urge to fix it quickly. Later, when Noah and Evan ran ahead toward the swings, Lucas stayed behind. "You're mad at me," Ethan said quietly, kneeling to his level but keeping a respectful distance. Lucas didn't deny it. "You weren't here before." Ethan felt the truth of that sentence strike deeper than any accusation Claire had ever made. "You're right," he said. "I wasn't." Lucas looked up, his blue eyes serious. "Are you going to go away again?" The question held no drama, only honest fear. Ethan didn't answer quickly. He knew that promising too easily would mean nothing. "I don't want to," he said finally. "And I'm doing everything I can to make sure I don't." Lucas studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, as if filing the answer away for later judgment. He didn't smile, but when he ran to catch up with his brothers, he glanced back only once to see if Ethan was still there. He was. That night, Claire confronted Ethan with the truth she had been circling for weeks. They sat across from each other at her kitchen table after the boys were asleep, the apartment quiet in a way that carried weight rather than peace. "They're getting attached," she said softly. "All of them." Ethan met her gaze without defensiveness. "I know. If you disappear," she continued, "it will break them in a way I won't be able to fix." "I won't," he said, and for the first time, the words didn't sound like a promise. They sounded like a decision. She studied his face, searching for certainty strong enough to withstand time and difficulty. "This isn't about guilt," she said. "Or fixing the past. This is about staying when it's hard." "I stayed when it was uncomfortable," Ethan replied. "Now I'm staying because it matters." Claire looked away, swallowing the tightness in her throat. She had built her life around not needing anyone, around surviving without expectation. Allowing someone back in meant rewriting that story, and she wasn't sure yet who she would be without it. Days later, the boys came home from preschool with drawings for a family project. 3 stick figures stood side by side in crayon, uneven and bright. "That's you," Noah announced proudly, pointing at one figure. "And that's Mommy," Evan added. Lucas hesitated, then pointed at the third. "That's Ethan." Claire froze. Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully as he stared at the paper, understanding the quiet magnitude of what had just happened. He did not touch the drawing. He did not comment right away. He simply nodded, respecting the space of the moment. That night, when he left the apartment, Claire stood at the door longer than usual. "Tomorrow?" she asked. Ethan smiled, small and careful. "Tomorrow." As he walked away, Claire closed the door slowly, her heart heavy with fear and something dangerously close to relief. The past had not been erased. The damage had not vanished. But for the first time, the future no longer felt like something she had to face alone. And for Ethan, the realization settled with sobering clarity. Staying was no longer a choice he made for redemption. It was the only choice that made sense. The moment everything finally settled did not arrive with celebration or dramatic declarations. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, hidden inside ordinary days that slowly stopped feeling fragile. Life continued to move forward, but now it did so with a steadiness that had once felt impossible. Ethan no longer arrived like a guest. He came with familiarity, with the ease of someone who belonged without needing to announce it. The boys ran to him without hesitation when he appeared, their movements instinctive rather than cautious. Lucas no longer watched him from a distance before deciding how to behave. Noah talked to him endlessly about everything and nothing. Evan climbed into his lap without asking, certain of the answer before the question formed. Claire noticed how natural it all became, and that realization frightened her more than the chaos ever had. She had learned how to survive uncertainty. Stability required a different kind of courage. One evening, after dinner, the boys fell asleep sprawled across the couch, limbs tangled together, exhausted from a day filled with noise and laughter. Ethan sat still, barely breathing, afraid to disturb them. Claire stood in the doorway watching the scene, a quiet ache forming in her chest. "You should go home," she said softly, though neither of them moved. "I can," Ethan replied. "If you want." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Stay. Just stay." They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy or defensive. It was thoughtful, careful, and strangely peaceful. They sat side by side, the city lights glowing faintly through the window, both aware that something irreversible had already happened. Weeks passed. Then months. Ethan rearranged his life not with grand gestures, but with consistency. Meetings ended earlier. Travel was limited. His priorities shifted quietly, without explanation or apology. People noticed, but he no longer cared to justify himself. For the first time, his success felt measured not by control, but by presence. Claire watched him choose the boys again and again, even when it cost him. Even when it was inconvenient. Even when no one was watching. And slowly, almost against her will, trust replaced vigilance. One afternoon, as they walked through the park together, Lucas stopped suddenly and turned back. "Are you really staying?" he asked, his voice calm but serious. Ethan crouched in front of him, his answer immediate and steady. "Yes. I'm staying." Lucas nodded, satisfied, and ran back to his brothers. Claire felt something inside her finally give way. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, she spoke the words she had held back for years. "When you accused me," she said quietly, "I thought that was the moment everything ended." Ethan looked at her, his expression open, unguarded. "It was the moment I was wrong," he said. "And I didn't understand the cost of that until now." She reached for his hand, slowly, deliberately. "I don't want the past rewritten," she said. "I just don't want it repeated." "It won't be," he replied. "Not if I can help it." They didn't promise forever. They didn't need to. What they had was built on something stronger than promises. It was built on proof. On a warm evening months later, the five of them stood together at another charity event. This time, Ethan did not stand apart. He stood beside Claire, the boys holding his hands, proud and unafraid. There were no accusations, no raised voices, no hidden truths waiting to surface. Only family. Sometimes people destroy everything because they are afraid to doubt themselves. Sometimes they lose years believing they were right. But when courage replaces pride, and presence replaces control, even the deepest wounds can heal. This time, Ethan did not raise his voice. He lowered his guard. And in doing so, he finally found what he had almost lost forever.